Welcome to a discussion in our Global Perspective series. Today's topic is decentralization on trial, what regulation means for Layer 1 governance in Europe. I'm really excited to have two great guests today, Nathalie Boyke and Nicolas Jacquemart. Thank you so much for coming. I would like to start off with you, or perhaps with each of us, giving a quick introduction on ourselves. Nathalie, would you like to start?
Happy to. I'm Nathalie Boyke. I am an independent consultant in Web3 and global policy, focusing on emerging technologies. And before that, I was working for Polkadot, leading the global policy team, and have a long history in communications too.
Excellent. My name is Nicolas Jacquemart. I'm the Chief Legal Officer of the Cardano Foundation. And my background is very much in IT law and contracts, followed by a PhD which actually dealt with a version of today's topic. So basically financial markets and regulation and permissionless systems. And then after that, I spent a number of years in the financial market regulatory space, working for FINMA, the Swiss Financial Market Supervisor. And then I went back into effectively private practice, but just in-house with the Cardano Foundation. So working on the same topic, but from the other side.
Yeah, my name is Oliver Völkel. I'm an attorney here in the city center of Vienna. 80 to 90% of what I'm doing is crypto related. Going back to the very early days when the only meaningful crypto that was around was Bitcoin, and advising clients today. Still in crypto-related matters all over the world. So I'm really glad you were able to come today. Our topic is decentralization on trial, what regulation means for Layer 1 governance in Europe. And I mean, perhaps to start and get everybody on board, not just the audience, but also ourselves, because it's really, I mean, if you want to discuss a topic, you need to have a common understanding of what we're actually talking about. And so I would like to ask both of you, I mean, first of all, what do you understand? Does this buzzword decentralization actually mean? But if you like, you can also, turn it around and say, what does it explicitly not mean? So where do we find lines of delineation between decentralization and centralization? I don't know. Would you like to start?
Sure, happy to. So I think obviously if you work for an L1, there's varying viewpoints for the topic of centralization and decentralization. I think fundamentally, to me as a lawyer, the classic lawyer answer is applicable here, which is it depends on what part of a layer 1 of one of these permissionless or permissioned for that matter, public or private for that matter, databases you're talking about, and which part of it you're really looking at, right? So there's effectively layers to the question of how centralized or decentralized any given system is. You can look at governance, right? The topic of today's discussion first and foremost. You can also look at other dimensions of it. You can look at tokenomics, right? Which is a classic discussion point. So who owns how many tokens, and what does that mean from a control perspective? You can look at it from a technical perspective at the level of the operators. So basically, who actually runs the infrastructure, right? Is it 10 nodes? Is it 100 nodes? Is it 1,000 nodes? And which one of these is superior or inferior? It really does depend on which dimension you're actually looking at. And in that sense, I don't think there is one answer to this question, which kind of, if you want to take it from the back, leads me to the conclusion that I don't believe that it is a very useful term or a very useful distinction if you're actually looking at these projects through the lens of financial market regulation in particular, right? Because in financial market regulation, typically what you're really looking for is you're looking to basically make a party responsible for whatever is happening, for the business activity that you're talking about. And there's usually better proxies for that in practice than whether something is centralized or decentralized. And we can get into that more in the continuation of today.
I'm going to take a step back here before I dive too deep into regulations, because you can obviously discuss whether this word makes sense even within the industry. nobody agrees on one definition really. But if I were to define it from my understanding, I will say in plain words, no single entity, no single person, no group of people, no company has the power to control or shut down the system. And also the power, the decision process and everything is distributed across a system and an infrastructure that is run by many individuals rather than one group of people, and the infrastructure is allowing for that. So it's like we have governance, that is like the framework that allows for the coordination of people in a network like this, and you have the infrastructure that creates a decentralization by distributing the information and the decision-making process across a number of nodes in many places, rather than just one single point of failure. So decentralization means removing this one single point of failure and enabling users to participate in the network.
Right. Since you said you want to take a step back, actually, I almost forgot. I wanted to ask the both of you actually how you came to, join Cardano, be involved in crypto blockchain related projects, advising on it. I mean, do you have some sort of specific moment when you first discovered the technology, or how did you come to crypto blockchain, Cardano in general? Nathalie?
I'm happy. Yeah, for me, it was COVID, and I decided I'm not going to learn baking bread, and instead looked into crypto. This is how I approached it, and I read, and the more I read, the more excited I got about it, because I understood. I think maybe I'm a very value-driven person, and I like the idea of an internet where people own their data again. There's no monopolies. I like the idea that there's an infrastructure for civil society that could hedge many of the risks we're facing right now. So I like the ethos of it. And yeah, at the time I realized, ooh, they're so gonna be regulated. And they're gonna need lobbyists, but nobody was looking for them at the time. And fast forward 2 years, I was doing exactly that for Polkadot.
I think my background is a bit more mundane in terms of how I got into it. I had a colleague when I was working as an IT lawyer that was really into Bitcoin, or rather his brother was really into Bitcoin. So that's effectively my first touch point, was hearing about it from him. And anyone who's met, especially Bitcoin maximalists, right, knows that they can be very vocal. So even though his brother was the Bitcoin maximalist, he was still sort of vocal by second degree, if you will. So that was kind of how I touched it first, and then that actually led to a PhD, right? So where my perception was simply a bit, I guess, similar to yours, that this was a new big thing, right? And writing a PhD about something like that would probably be both interesting, but also potentially a good move from a career perspective. And that in turn then, without planning it at all, right, led me to financial market supervision and FINMA, because they had the issue in the ICO craze, sort of 2015, 16, 17, that they had a ton of these requests, and a lot of people were asking a lot of questions about what the rules were, and they didn't have a lot of people, and were struggling to find people who understood the technical side at least enough to then articulate a legal opinion on it. Right, and I happened to fit the bill for that, so that was effectively how I landed there. And then Cardano was really a product of a different blockchain project, which was Libra and Diem, which is probably something that most people still remember, which of course was a project that sat with FINMA for a number of years. And in that period, I was very heavily involved with it, both from a policy side, but also from a permissioning side, because they were seeking a license in Switzerland. And again, we had to basically make it fit, right? The question was, how does this fit into the regulatory landscape, if at all? And that kind of really, whet my appetite, I guess, for this L1 space and the notion of really these infrastructures.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So you said you were working with FINMA when this whole ICO craze came about, right?
Yes.
I mean, obviously without touching on confidentiality or privileged information here, can you give us, a little bit of a, background or an idea of what it looked like back then? I mean, Switzerland was obviously the place to go when you wanted to do these ICO ICOs back then?
Right. So I joined FINMA on the tail end of the ICO craze, I would say. So the big wave had already kind of passed, but obviously, the wave was pretty slow in coming down. So there were still a ton of cases and a ton of policy questions that were open. I think fundamentally it was actually, like many things in sort of the public service space, it was very much trying to find balance between giving people an answer in a reasonable time period so that they could decide whether they wanted to do the project or not, versus limited resources, especially in a new space, with a limited amount of people that understood enough to really have opinions about whether this fit and how it fits into financial market regulation in Switzerland. And just, a lot of new questions, right? Both technologically, but also from a governance perspective and from a legal perspective. So it really was that. I mean, FINMA was struggling to keep up, right? Like many regulators at that time with all of the requests. But I think FINMA did take a few smart decisions pretty early on. And one of them was that their whole premise going into it was, if we can apply existing rules, we will apply existing rules, right? And many people think that FINMA made a lot of new rules in this time for ICOs. They really didn't. It was mostly just existing law and existing practice applied to a new technology stack, right? Mm-hmm. That was mostly what it was. And that actually enabled a lot of answers that a lot of regulators internationally were maybe more hesitant or more cautious to give, right? Mm-hmm. So it was more a combination of that approach plus maybe a bit of a higher risk appetite than maybe some regulators internationally to put themselves out there and have an opinion.
Would you say that was the reason Switzerland was so much faster in creating some legal certainty than other places, because they just applied what they had and made it work?
Definitely, yes. I think that was really the main differentiator. And even today, I meet people who are who have this view that Switzerland was first because they made new rules first, and that's really just largely not the case. There are some areas where that applied, but generally speaking, it was just the existing rules. And this is just a database question, right? It's an infrastructure question, and then sometimes it fits, sometimes it doesn't. But overall, it fit decently well. And I mean, this idea of there is an equity token, there is a payment token, and there is sort of everything else that doesn't fit the box, right? It's not really rocket science in financial market regulation terms, because it is very much what the financial market regulation globally has already kind of divided the world into. But it was, I think, the willingness to take a risk and apply that to this new technology that really set FINMA apart in those early days. And I would also say FINMA was not the only jurisdiction that did this, right? There were a few others that jumped on the same sort of idea pretty quickly. So.
Right. But if you had to guess why it was that Switzerland was basically the first jurisdiction to be, I don't want to say flooded, but to have, to be inviting so many ICOs, what do you think that could be boiled down to?
I do think legal certainty played a big role, right? Because obviously, especially for, when Ethereum did it, right, everyone else kind of saw that this model worked. And that in combination with the fact that Switzerland does have a reputation in the financial and market regulatory space as being obviously a financial hub with some pretty big banks and other actors, those two things are obviously very attractive when you're trying to do something that effectively involves raising capital for a technology project. I think really those were the two factors that drove most of it, especially around these foundations, right? That sort of these crypto foundations that became the norm as a mechanism for incorporation. And to me, it's been fascinating to see now how there's been this almost sort of, not just against the Swiss foundation model, but generally this backlash in the last 6 to 12 months with the changing regulatory landscape, where especially some of the bigger VC actors in the space are effectively saying, you don't need these foundations, right? The private sector should own all the tokens. I mean, that's kind of what it boils down to, which to me at least, I think is also kind of an expression of the moment we're in, where people feel much more comfortable saying, yeah, we're doing a token raise, right? We're issuing tokens. That's how we do governance, how we raise money, how we manage the project. And I think back in the day, it was very much sort of people wanted this foundation layer also just as a safeguard from a regulatory and legal side.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely the case that Switzerland had a huge head start compared to the rest of the world. I mean, other jurisdictions then tried to follow suit. And I'm really curious to get your perspective, but perhaps we'll discuss this at a later point today, get your perspective as to you know, how this all played out. And then all of a sudden European Union came along with their own regulation, and Switzerland being in the center of it, and just getting your perspective on how that works. But before we you know, get to that topic, I recalled, Nathalie, that you were, I mean, you were working for Polkadot, and if I remember correctly, you were also responsible for discussions that were taking place in the US with the regulator.
Yes.
Can you give us a bit of background on that?
Yes, sure. At the time, Gary Gensler, the head of the SEC, was very actively promoting against crypto, and he was opening one lawsuit after another, going after blockchains and saying that every token is a security. Polkadot at the time had a good position in terms of having had over 50 meetings with the SEC. So the point was, when they were planning their ICO, it was already clear that the SEC would very likely view that whole procedure as a act of security. And there was an open invite at a time from the FinHub, hey, come in and talk. And there's two ways to go here. The Ripple way, basically go for litigation worst case, or comply and talk and see what happens. And Polkadot's way at the time was very much, let's comply, let's talk, let's collaborate. And they went into the FinHub and talked. And the FinHub, I mean, everything is new, right? Nobody really knew how to deal with this. So over 50 meetings, they talked, they explained the technology. On the other hand, you have, you know, the SEC having their Howey test and how to define whether or not a token is a security. And basically you compare it with a publicly listed company, right? Do you qualify with the same? Do you have the same type of control? Do you comply with marketing, whatever measurements? Do you market your token as an investment? Do you have X amount of token that would give you the majority control? All these kind of aspects they were looking in to kind of compare with a publicly listed company. Problem is, this is a technical stack. Even if you had whatever 30% of all the token wouldn't give you full control, versus in a publicly listed company it would, right? So the thresholds are coming from investment world don't make necessarily sense in a technical blockchain setup, decentralization setup. But this is where their thinking is coming from. So having had these discussions and complying step by step meant decentralizing step by step, giving up the pseudo key, the admin key, making sure that the marketing wasn't promoting the staking fees or the staking rewards as a great interest. And all these kind of minor steps, giving up more and more control, having a governance model, all of these steps were decentralizing and therefore giving up control, managerial control. So as Polkadot did all that over 50 meetings, there was this point where the SEC had nothing left to complain. And at that point, you would want some sort of certainty or some sort of no action letter that they leave you alone. But they are not in the business of giving these letters. They're just like, yeah, we have nothing to complain.
We might in the future, right?
But we were not, you know, we're not signing for Gary Gensler, right? So that was a bit of a frustrating outcome after so much, collaboration, to not have any security out of this. You did well, you're safe now. And at the time, the first discussions in the Congress started because people were upset that Gary Gensler is taking legal actions, but he's not supposed to replace the Congress, and they should be making laws and regulations. So they started, gathering information. And at the time we went and basically told everybody that story in the Congress to kind of highlight the injustice of the process, or that there is no process really. And that led to an invite to the Congress and a public hearing where the Republicans invited not only like Polkadot, but also I think Kraken was there, and the stock market exchange of the US. And the idea was to tell that story to kind of emphasize that there is no legal way and process, and even if you play by the rules, you're empty-handed, and that was the whole story. And in the end, a lot of the points we made and also the process we went through ended in the draft, the first draft of FIT 21, which was quite nice because it was also about how, I think you differentiate in that in terms of how decentralized is a system, and should you measure the grade of decentralization as a measure of should it be a security or not in that case, and financial regulations. In that case, it made sense to a point, and I think the key word is sufficiently decentralized. Like, at what point are you sufficiently decentralized? Because I think fully decentralized, like MiCA says, is like utopia. But let's say sufficiently, and what are the markers? And if you go by the Howey test, could you kind of measure control and managerial control? And by that logic, we went through it. And of course, if you're not that decentralized in reality, but in name only, you know, then this definition might become a problem at some point.
Yeah, I mean, actually that's a good segue to one of the topics that I wanted to discuss, this becoming decentralized, because I think it's clear that you know, some projects start out pretty centralized, with an aim to get decentralized soon. And I mean, perhaps if we come to Cardano, is Cardano decentralized?
Yes, across many dimensions, right? But again, the question is, and I think this is a very fair point, the question is, what are you measuring it against, right? Are you measuring it against a standard that is set by, you know, lawmakers or regulators in terms of you are decentralized? If you are decentralized enough, then you do not fall within certain regimes, be it the security regime in the US, be it maybe prudential supervisory regimes in certain jurisdictions. That, you know, I think is one way of looking at the problem. One of the reasons I'm not a huge fan of decentralization from a legal perspective as sort of a measure and a test is because you get into this question of what's the incentive. And fundamentally, the incentive should be to build useful technologies that have, you know, useful traits, and not to aim for some largely, at the end of the day, arbitrary threshold for, you know, decentralization that effectively is sort of set once and then forgotten, because that's kind of what ends up happening. If you look at FIT 21 in the US, which obviously has not become law, it is now morphed into something slightly different, right? And we'll see in the next few months, likely, whether it will become the new framework for the US. But that's what was happening, right? People were setting a threshold and saying, well, you know, 20% token ownership, right, control is the threshold. Unless if you have more than that, then you are not sufficiently decentralized. That's pretty arbitrary. There's not really a good reason for that. Again, it's sort of a derivative, I guess, of the stock, you know, background of the Howey test to some degree. There are some other factors that flow into it. So I think this is kind of the fundamental issue I have with the notion. But I mean, it is a fact that if you need to measure something, if you need to find some kind of dividing line, then, you know, maybe this is the only one that you can agree on. And there's, of course, a practical reality in politics as well, that if you want to agree on something, that you maybe have to take, you know, the good and the bad. I think to your question about Cardano, right, if you look at the dimensions that I think we care most about, so one of those is SPOs, so basically the people who actually operate the network. There, Cardano has, depending on how you slice the cake and how you look at it, somewhere between a few hundred and 2,500 stake pools. So, you know, I would call that pretty decentralized, right, on a spectrum between AWS type services, right, cloud services, and effectively what this is. But all of that comes at a cost, right? I mean, that's just also the reality. Decentralization costs. It costs overhead, it costs effort. You lose certain traits, like, for example, settlement speed, that may make you less attractive as an infrastructure. So it's always trade-offs. It's trade-offs all the way down the stack. And that's why this is a really interesting, but also kind of a difficult topic to have, I think, a regulatory discussion about. You can look at other dimensions. On the dev side, for example, Cardano is certainly not as decentralized as something like Ethereum, simply because there are not as many developers, right? But we would probably still say that, you know, it is decentralized enough because there are still a few hundred people building at any given time in and around Cardano. So, again, the question is, what are you measuring and for what purpose? If you look at tokenomics, Cardano is definitely among the more decentralized. It's been a long time since there was sort of really big holders of ADA, that held sort of double-digit percentages, at least that we know of. Again, this is another interesting fact. In many of these systems, you might not know on any given day exactly who owns which tokens, right? Because it is not a completely transparent system in terms of the actual wallets and the actual ownership. And this applies to basically all blockchains. So again, it can be actually quite challenging to measure some of these metrics as well. Another one that where I think Cardano does have a bit of an edge, and I think interestingly might actually turn out to be relevant for the US regulatory side, is the governance system. So about a year ago, which Polkadot has also been a trailblazer of, right? In terms of basically having a bottom-up, if you will, governance system, where basically people can have opinions and voice those opinions within the infrastructure itself, right? So there's a voting component to it, where people can actually participate in the governance model. And Cardano has had that now for about a year. And I think that might actually end up being relevant in certain jurisdictions because, that's one thing people have latched onto as an idea, right? That the governance system needs to sort of be bottom up.
I mean, I agree with you. In the US, the specific case was just, there was no option to, you shouldn't, agree with you, you shouldn't treat the technology as the financial, regulated as a financial instrument in that sense. And decentralization maybe shouldn't be the indicator for that because it has a technical reason in many, many ways, right? It's infrastructure, it's so much more than just control over a digital asset in that sense. And in the US, the only problem was they were not giving you had the choice between commodity or security. There was no tech regulation in the talks, right? So you had to kind of find your space and define your space within that narrow kind of gap. But
they were trying to fit it into the Howey test, right? And that's fundamentally sort of one of the issues.
The closest thing, but I agree with you. Ideally, you would be tech neutral. You would let tech be tech and just regulate the activity in itself. So someone on an exchange trading it is the activity, but the token itself has so many other uses. Its intention is not necessarily to be a means of trade.
Yeah, what I've noticed in practice is oftentimes it's a really practical approach. If you don't have to go, if there's nobody to go after from the perspective of a regulator, then there's usually good grounds to believe that this is a fully or sufficient decentralized system. What I've also noticed in practice, and I'm not saying that this is the definitive guide to determining whether or not a system is decentralized or not, but I've looked at a couple of systems, and what I've noticed as a common denominator sort of is in those systems people interact with one another, but usually they don't do that simultaneously, and they don't do it on the basis of contractual agreements. If I look at, this could be a whole discussion in and of itself, but if you look at how Layer-1 blockchains are structured, usually it's not necessary to. I don't need to have a contract with any other of Bitcoin miners if I want to participate in the block production. I can just be part of it. If I want to send, or if I want to have a transaction request become part of the blockchain, I can, just send out the request to the network and hope that my transaction request will be included in the block. It's not like I have a contractual claim against any of the miners to include my block in my transaction in a block. And so what I've noticed is that it's a pretty good marker to look for whether or not there's contractual relationships between the people who interact in these systems. And what I like to compare it to, I'm not sure if it's a apt comparison, but what I like to imagine in my head is sort of a marketplace where the rules are set in stone, like put a banana here and you might take a gold coin on the other hand on the scale, for example, and just people adhering to these rules. In practice, of course, we know because they have no option but to adhere to these rules because they're self-enforcing. I mean, we're also now getting into discussion also on, away from layer 1, but also, to layer 2 projects where, the code might look differently and give, admins certain rights, for example. But what I like to imagine is this marketplace where people interact with one another in a way they cannot really choose. Like, you are familiar with the phrase code is law. Basically, it's self-enforcing, the rules are set in stone, you can go there, you can put your apple or your banana on the scale, you can remove the gold token from the other hand, and you do not need anybody to enforce these rules. So, what do you think of this analogy?
I have to say, putting on sort of my former hat, right, in the financial market regulatory space, I don't think you would find a lot of takers for that kind of approach, because typically really what it boils down to is if you look at what are the goals of financial market regulation, right? Historically, it's protecting the individuals that participate in the financial market. That's the older principle, the older goal. That's about 150 years old or so, depending on where you look. And then there is effectively this newer idea of protecting sort of the function of the market as a whole, which is more a 2008 financial crisis topic, right? Which is this sort of infection risk. We have a global financial market. We don't want to pull the whole system down, and we want to protect that. And the truth is that when you look at it through that lens, right, really it often boils down to the question of, does the system, do these infrastructures that people use, do they sort of protect particularly the individual participants, right, from the worst things? So in that sense, you're right, that it does matter how these systems work, right? Whether or not you will get attention from financial market regulators. And I mean, in practice, if you look at the main scandals and the big cases in the crypto world, they tend to actually not be at the infrastructure layer, right? They tend to be at the business model layer, so basically people building businesses on top of these tokens and assets and infrastructures, and then those businesses oftentimes emulating or sometimes outright copying existing functions within the financial market. FTX is the prime example for this, right? Where effectively you're looking at sort of a mixture of an exchange and a banking activity that was effectively unregulated and made a lot of the mistakes that, traditional banks and exchanges have historically made that actually resulted in many instances in financial market regulation. Right? People sometimes forget that when you go back 200 years, there wasn't really anything in this space, in the financial market regulatory space. And then over time, many times because of scandals and people losing a lot of money and losing trust, we added layers and layers of regulation onto these systems. So I do think that there is going to be, a time when, if these infrastructures, particularly if they become critical, where there will be more questioning of the infrastructure layer in this space as well, in terms of, well, how do we handle this, right? It's a risk factor.
I have a question. I mean, technically, okay, financial regulators are avoiding the systemic risks or trying to avoid the systemic risks we've seen, like 2008 crisis, all these kind of issues where a centralized group of people with a lot of power over financial infrastructure abused the system, right? Were corrupted, however. And then Bitcoin came along and other decentralized projects trying to actually resolve exactly that issue, right? Creating a decentralized infrastructure where you can have transactions in a decentralized way and avoiding the point of failure, single point of power, and avoiding corruption. Do you think from your old hat, looking from your old hat, these risks have been now decreased? And as you mentioned, FTX and these kind of examples were actually centralized entities on a blockchain. So again, I mean, the industry suffers from the bad image because of these scandals, but actually they're just proving a system that hasn't worked again and again, right? So it's like the question is like, shouldn't financial market authorities consider a new point of view in terms of how to manage these kind of risks and whether or not this infrastructure might help?
But I think what you see in practice is exactly that, right? So I think if you look at the practice of financial market, both regulation and supervision in many jurisdictions, what you will find is that the infrastructures are not the primary interest, right? So the Bitcoin infrastructure, the Ethereum infrastructure, the layer 1 itself, is not what regulators sort of really are focused on. The US was a special case, and the reason there really it has a lot to do with the goal that I mentioned, right, with protecting investors. The US, the Howey test just works quite a bit differently than it does in many civil law jurisdictions, to get sort of a bit nerdier, right? But in the European jurisdictional context, and the Swiss one in particular, the way that we define equities, right, is much more tied to the contracts. You mentioned it before, right, to this notion that you need a contractual claim. In the US, the definition is quite a bit broader. That has a lot to do with the history of how the Howey test came about, right? And it worked pretty well, I mean, to be fair, right, for about 80 years or so, until it kind of met this crypto sphere, and the test kind of broke down a bit in places, or at least it was used in a way that I think went a bit too far, at least in parts of the market. But I do actually think that what you see in practice is that financial market regulators, and certainly in my time doing that work, the focus was much more on the application layer and on the business model layer, right? People building businesses on top of. And then the questions often were in practice, who's earning money, right? Who controls basically what comes out of this product? That was one of the things we looked at very much, right, was where does the money actually go to for, you know, DEXs and such things, right?
I mean, you're right to a point. The infrastructure level, yes, it's kind of left out for the time being, only because they don't know how to crack down on it yet, with a point of view of a regulator that always is looking for the intermediary to make accountable for. But there have been attempts in cracking down or looking into DeFi more, because they are facilitating financial services. And I think the Danish FSA was an example, or made an attempt of looking into financial services, let's say Uniswap, how to kind of address responsibility and accountability in a setup like this, where there is like a blockchain, a decentralized blockchain, but there is someone providing an interface and therefore facilitating financial services like any online banking of any bank is doing. That was their comparison. So I'm saying, I don't think just because it hasn't happened yet doesn't mean it's there. Like there is a huge understanding of, oh, that shouldn't be touched. It's just we don't know how yet.
Yeah, and I fear that there is a strong likelihood that you know, even if there's a fully decentralized system in the background, let's say a decentralized exchange, I fear that, you know, the people who grant easier access to those systems, like a website, those are going to be the service providers that will be covered under regulation next, pretty certain.
Yeah, I don't disagree with either of you. I mean, in practical terms, right, but that's what I was saying in terms of the application layer versus the infrastructure layer. So a DEX, to me, in that context, is an application built on top of an existing infrastructure. I mean, I think about it in similar terms to if you're using AWS to run a traditional exchange, right? You're not regulating the AWS servers, you're regulating the exchange activity. And that's what I mean when you, and a lot of that is driven by, again, the goals of financial market regulation, right? Which is protecting the end user in the context of a financial market application. The financial market application here being the exchange activity, exchanging one financial asset, depends on the jurisdiction you're in, right? But one asset certainly for another asset, and the mechanisms and rules and safeguards built into that kind of activity. And one of the questions in the context of DeFi and all of this that I think, yes, is universal, especially now, and especially also because of MiCA and some of the things it says or doesn't say about this question, is it enough if you're running a front end, right? Like that's one of the classical sort of dividing lines that you're now seeing. And if so, what if you don't earn money from the front end, right? Does that change qualitatively the nature of the activity? What if you're only earning a tiny amount, right? It's just enough to basically cover the cost of running the front end, but not actually paying out anything. I think these are all like qualitative questions in terms of whether something falls under a regulatory regime or not. But again, I think at the infrastructure level, and this has precedent, right? You don't actually see the same kind of interest if it isn't about the token. The token's got a lot of scrutiny, especially in the US. but the infrastructures themselves, and this is not without precedent within the financial market, infrastructures, so financial market infrastructures, right, ones that are specifically built to do financial market things, so payments, for example, in many jurisdictions are less regulated if they don't have systemic relevance. So the regulatory regime is often, comparatively to a bank, quite permissive, that you can actually do quite a few things up to a certain size. And then, you know, at some point you're going to be sort of important enough that from a systemic perspective, people are worried that if you fail, the whole system might come crashing down. But that's effectively already now, today, in many jurisdictions, the dividing line. And I think if, which we don't know, but if a permissionless, public permissionless system ever becomes systemic from the perspective of the financial market regulator, then I think you're going to see a very interesting debate, right? Because then the question really becomes, what does that mean, and what's the remedy? Because the traditional remedies don't really work because of how these infrastructures operate.
Right. I mean, you could imagine then the regulator or the lawmaker to pass a law requesting, you know, everybody who is actively working on the Bitcoin protocol or the Cardano protocol or whichever layer protocol you would like to choose, to actively request them to put, you know, certain functions in. However, that would work in practice, since fortunately, at least, the scope of jurisdiction of any given country is rather limited, unless, of course, this is then, you know, a consorted effort on a worldwide level, which would make it a bit, more difficult to withstand such requests. But I mean, this is, I guess, far, far in the future. Or have you ever heard of any such, considerations being uttered by anyone?
I mean, a version of this was discussed in the Libra Diem project. Now, that was a very different infrastructure, right? It was largely permissioned, so there was much more control. But there was a discussion there about, you know, the question of what do you do if this becomes systemically relevant, especially at a global context. One thing we also shouldn't forget is, if you look at financial market infrastructures, so just for sort of the audience, right, that's typically payment systems, settlement systems for equities and other assets, and then basically the exchanges themselves. Traditionally, those are the three categories. And if you look at those, there aren't really any global ones. At least not sort of with, you know, reach everywhere, which is one of the things that scared a lot of regulators and national banks about Libra when it first came out, was this notion, the fusion of big tech and, you know, something blockchain permissionless, which was the first pitch. That scared a lot of people in the space, because they thought, well, if these two things come together, it will almost automatically become systemic, just because of the size of the Facebook audience in particular. You know, what are we going to do with this thing, right? And so I do think this has been discussed, but no, not practically for the permissionless infrastructures today. The numbers are being looked at. So the G20 do look in sort of a rhythm at how big of an influence and how big the connection is between the traditional financial market and the DeFi space. So that is a consideration, but not in terms of what to do, as far as I'm aware.
I mean, I don't think it was a problem because tech and permissionless came together. I think it was a problem because real world fiat money came together with permissionless, and, you know, I think that's the aspect, because that's when it becomes systemic. The fear was, if a player like Facebook, that is already having such a huge trust and reach, is creating a digital currency backed by a real currency, a US currency, by the way, and a lot of people buy that, all this purchasing power goes out to the US dollar, right? And that could destabilize the European money market. And that's the real fear here, loss of control of that. If it was just some random, whatever, token exchange, with Bitcoin, they didn't jump yet, right? It was the stablecoin aspect of it, the connecting it to real fiat currencies. And I think this is where it became a systemic risk and the fear rise. And that's, I think, very political as of now. I mean, you're still seeing right now the Genius Act in the US. I mean, they are connecting or making everybody who wants to issue US dollar stablecoins having to buy US dollar debt. So basically now you're buying US dollar debt and helping them with their financial crisis. And before it was gold and before it was oil. So they're continuing that policy with stablecoins. And you have to also consider historically, when it comes to finances, it has always been a political arm in terms of sanctions that has been used as political power. And we know that stable coins have been used to freeze assets like CERHA, also for political reasons and sanctions and for heists and whatever. But the point is, it's programmable money. You can freeze it, you can follow up on it, you can, there's a lot of control involved, but it's also political, and that's why, in my opinion, it was a systemic risk rather than just, tech and permissionless coming together.
Yeah, it wasn't so much the tech and permissionless, right? I mean, you're right. The one other dimension of Libra that scared especially national banks, especially developing countries, was the fact that money substitution, right? So the question of what happens if everyone's suddenly using basically dollar-based stablecoins through Facebook, right? So that was the multiplier effectively that worried many of the involved countries. But you have to remember, Libra originally, when it launched, was not a dollar-based stablecoin. It was a multi-currency basket stablecoin.
Yeah.
And that actually, to many, was an even bigger concern, because there was this very, and I don't think completely far-fetched, fear that this would become the de facto internet currency, right? Because of Facebook's reach. And in the consortium, at least initially, after the political pressure, a few people left. But there were also quite a few big payment systems providers and other actors that would have amplified this basically multiplier that Facebook brought inherently anyway. And that was a very real thing that I think actually from our perspective at the time in the project was also a learning, right? I mean, initially we looked at it more as a tech and effectively a structuring problem from a permissioning perspective, because that was the Swiss perspective, like, does this fit a bucket that we have? But over time it became clear that this was also very much a political question, right, internationally. So it was a fascinating time, and I do think, again, this was the first time, I mean, this is also what accelerated MiCA, just in practical terms, right, because it scared people on the regulator international bank side that this project could even be thought of and conceived of and actually pushed with quite a lot of resourcing from the Silicon Valley side. And I think that fusion of big tech and sort of money is something that still today actually I think concerns people. And I think you're seeing now, which is fascinating, right, a wave of big, small tech financial market companies, the Stripes, the Robinhoods of the world, that are building their own Layer-1s. They're building their own infrastructures, which is also not new, right? Financial institutions historically have often ended up building, at least partially, their own infrastructures when they felt that what they were getting from the market was not good enough. And it's quite fascinating that now that the regime is easier in the US, suddenly all of these companies are saying, oh, you know what? The existing L1s and blockchains are actually sort of not good enough for what we need. We're going to build our own just for stablecoins, right? Or just for equity. And it's fascinating. I mean, we'll see where that plays out. I don't think anybody really knows where that's going to end. Are they going to be successful with that or not? So
yeah, I mean, it's also interesting to see that when you look at the payment service providers, or at the payment side of the matter, the Visas, the MasterCards, they control, I don't have the figures in my head, a huge chunk also in terms of the European payments that are being processed. And I mean, we do have regulation on that. It's not that tedious, really. It's more of a, collecting statistical data, applying, limited rules. Let's put it that way. In terms of, if you compare it to the banking regime, for example. I do have my own thoughts of why that's the case, but I would like to get your intuitions or ideas. Why do you think, when it comes to stable coins, Libra Diem, that the reaction from the from the lawmaker in Europe was a bit different than compared to just payment processors such as Visa or MasterCard?
The issuance aspect of it, I think, I mean, I agree with Nicolas in the terms of big tech coming into play, having a lot of power, a lot of resources. I mean, I agree that MasterCard and Visa, I think it's over 90% usage in Europe, and they're American companies. I think that is a concern. I think that is one of the reasons CBDC is something they want. I mean, not the only reason, but one of this. If you ask C-level bankers whether or not they want a CBDC and if they want to build the infrastructure for it, they don't see a point because they have a functioning e-money system, right? And they don't see it, but I think the discussion is much more a political one at this point. Especially with the US making moves and pushing for stablecoins. They're not going for CBDCs, they have a ban on it, right? They're only pushing the private stablecoins. But I think this is where the interesting things are happening. I'm not 100% sure why stablecoins and not MasterCard and Visa. I think the functionality at the time was bigger, plus they trust centralized institutions, and stablecoins seemed ambiguous and opaque at the time, I think. New technology coming into that.
Yeah, I don't know for sure, right? I don't know exactly what the discussions at the EU level are about this factor, aside from, I think, what you mentioned, right, about that there's definitely a conversation now, I think, much more so than maybe a few years ago, about sovereignty, right? Digital sovereignty, and part of that is the question of, well, what kind of payment systems. Technically, Master and Visa card are sort of more like payment processors than actual payment systems, typically, right? But again, I think overall there is this discussion now, and CBDC is one possible answer to it. If you can get it to the adoption stage where it's actually generally accepted, which is always the big challenge of payment systems, right? It's to get people to actually use it. It's non-trivial. So, but I think on the why are stablecoins looked at differently, or why were they also looked at differently, I really think it has, on the surface at least, everything to do with the balance sheet risk, right? In stablecoins, there is an actual balance sheet risk. In what MasterCard and Visa does, there typically isn't. So the user, as a user of stablecoins, I'm putting my money in and receiving stablecoins back, right? At least in the sort of traditional issuance model. So the question then immediately becomes, and this was a huge debate in Switzerland, right, are these projects payment systems, payment infrastructures for legal purposes, or are they banks? Because there's only sort of these two choices, at least in the Swiss regime. And, luckily, whoever wrote the original laws for this piece of legislation in Switzerland actually kind of anticipated this, probably not this, but a version of this, by basically saying, hey, a payment system can actually also have bank-like features, and then basically banking rules apply to it. If that hadn't been the case, I'm not sure what we would have actually done at the time with Libra and Diem, because it wouldn't have really fit either box very well, right? But typically the balance sheet risk is, the P&L risk is sort of why you see this strong distinction between the two activities.
I mean, to bring in two more aspects, consumer protection is a big point here too, right? The ability, or to make sure that people can redeem the assets, like if they want to, like I put in euro or dollar, I want that back. And before it was regulated, I mean, some of these stablecoin issuers weren't even fully backed. I mean, you were literally just trusting they are having one-to-one, assets backed in the background. And they were investing and doing all kinds of stuff with it. And right now, at least you have this regulation where it kind of defines what they can do, how much risk they can take, and they have to be able 100% to redeem people who are invested.
And you don't have that issue with MasterCard and Visa, right? MasterCard and Visa use existing banks typically for the last mile customer relationship. So usually you're talking about transferring money that is with a regulated bank to a regulated bank, or at least a regulated e-money provider, or whatever else sort of the regime is. Also across borders, right? And that's typically why you don't see the same reaction in the regulatory space to these different models.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's also at play here is, while Visa, MasterCard and other payment processors only earn a small fee, I think it, goes back to what you, Nathalie, said earlier regarding the Genius Act and, the US trying to funnel in funds from all over the world to fund US stable coins, because they need to be backed by US dollar treasury bills. Interesting part is also under MiCA, if you want to be an issuer of e-money tokens, is the term that is used, you need to be a credit institution or an e-money institution. Then you can issue fiat-backed stablecoins, and MiCA, or actually level 2 and 3 guidance, delegated regulation, prescribes precisely what you can do with the funds. So the concept is rather similar to what the US does, prescribing what you can do with the funds you collect. Interestingly enough, in Europe, as of today, there's no restriction to invest into European assets or into European state debt. In fact, you could even invest it into US Treasury bills. It's really great insight that the US put this, their idea of making the dollar the central currency for a specific system, be it gold, be it oil, now be it crypto. I think this has much to do with this fear, or the stronger regulation we see with stable coins. However, this main problem is not really addressed. So under the European regime, we could also see investments into US Treasury bills. You said earlier, well, the US had or the world sees financial markets for 100 years, or has seen them for 100 years or even longer. And a lot of regulation came about as a sort of answer to what was not going in the right direction in the markets. I see it, I totally agree, I see it as you do. And also what I think is really interesting is to note that the crypto industry seems to go through exactly the same mistakes and see exactly the same process as did the regular financial market, however in a period that was much larger. So now we are at a point where we do have regulation. Just looking back 5 years, we did not. How was life back then? Are we glad that we have regulation now? How do we view this?
It's an excellent question. I think it's a bit of a mixed bag, right? I think for certain business models, I don't think they work unless you have some kind of legal regime and some kind of recognition. And I think from a scaling perspective, if you want to scale and you want to bring in particularly the institutional money, right? So the hedge funds, the banks, the people who effectively can scale your business, I do think having some form of regulatory assurance and regulatory regime for, let's just take an example of a CASP, right, under MiCA. I do think that is almost unavoidable. I don't think you're going to bring in the big institutional funds and also investments, right, which is often the other challenge that crypto companies can face, without some kind of framework that is recognized and gives people that legal certainty. Fundamentally, that's really what it's about, right? That their investment, that the money they're bringing in fits within a certain rule set. So for that, I do think the regulation is an improvement. Now, of course, the devil, as always, is in the details, right? If the regulation is so burdensome in practice that the business models that came basically into existence when the regulation didn't exist, then you might end up in a situation that you've effectively written laws for no one, because there's actually no business case. And I do think that that's always a risk when you effectively have a business model that's existing and you backfit, the regulation to it. Again, I would say, though, that's not new. So in many jurisdictions, there was little to no banking regulation, or maybe a state-based banking regulation in the early 20th century, or maybe the outgoing 19th century. And then, there were a few crises, people lost a lot of money, there was bank collapse, etc., because things were becoming more interconnected and things were moving much more quickly than they were, 150 years before that. And as a consequence, a lot of jurisdictions, basically including Switzerland, which is sort of my wheelhouse, because I did a lot of work on that, passed effectively federal banking laws, right? And said, these are the standards that we will hold all financial institutions to. You need a license and all of these things. And at the time, if you go back and you read these sources, there was a lot of crying and gnashing of teeth. That does remind me sometimes of sort of the space that I'm working in now, where people were saying, well, if you do this, like, banking is dead, right? Nobody's going to do banking, it won't be worth the money, etc. So there's always this push and pull. Sometimes laws are actually just so burdensome that they kill a sort of an area of business. That does actually happen, right? Now, so far, I think with MiCA, there are people getting licenses, right? Nobody seems to be very happy with it, but at the same time, at least in some jurisdictions, people do actually seem to be, I mean, Austria is one of them, right? That people are actually getting licensed. So I think it seems to be working okay. I think you'll really know in 4 or 5 years, right? When some of these businesses have actually been under supervision for a while, whether the business case holds up and whether it actually makes sense, especially in the next, like, really sort of crash of the market, because that's usually when you really test these things.
I mean, generally, what would be the ideal state, right? Ideal state would be regulation creating legal certainty, while also creating an environment where you can test and try new things. Right now, we have legal certainty, but I will say, because we have learned from the financial industry, they kind of jumped right to the very end. And the question is there enough space, not to the very end, fair enough, but I mean, is there, but very, very far ahead in terms of compliance, things you have to fulfill. And if you consider, the question is there still space for newcomers? I think the things you have to comply to and do before you are even able to exist are very high. And I think something we should advocate for is some sort of grace period where startups can actually have time to mature to a point where they're able to comply. I mean, I know you have your former hat on, but it's just unreal. And also decentralization. I mean, no one is decentralized from day one. There is always a small team having to kick off a thing, but there should be a process that allows or acknowledges the fact that projects are developing, they're not done on day one. It's a process, and there should be some legal grace period for that, especially if in Europe we want startups, we want something to grow, and we want that independency, also an infrastructure. That should be something that exists, and that's missing right now.
Can I just quickly make one point? Because I actually was thinking more in terms of sort of the innovation side of the space, right? And I agree with you. I think one of the issues that generally when tech meets sort of financial products is this question of how do you create a space where people can still innovate? Because the truth is that this type of regulation is inherently, it doesn't really want people to take risks when it comes to other people potentially losing money. That's literally sort of the opposite of what it's actually intended to do, which inherently leads to the situation that you're describing. One of the things that I actually find from a policy perspective, even if it is not a detriment to Cardano, in our case, quite concerning are these discussions in the US about, grandfathering regimes for effectively the older layer 1 infrastructures, right? I understand why this discussion is happening, because it's simpler, because there is, of course, this presumption that if you survive for 5, 6, 7 years, right?
Too big to fail.
Yeah, then there's sort of, there must be something there, right, effectively. But I think from an innovation perspective, it's actually, I'm not sure it's good policy, basically, right? Because what you're effectively doing is you're creating a moat between the people who come now and might have a brilliant idea and the people who, by happenstance, to some degree, came 6 or 7 years ago. And what you might end up doing is basically just, like many people say in banking, right? There's a huge moat to get into banking that is used by incumbents to protect themselves from competition. And I think you might be creating kind of a similar situation for the L1s, which is kind of bizarre given, the underpinning philosophy of sort of we're trying to get rid of powerful intermediaries and we're trying to get rid of the moats and, the things that protect incumbents. So.
Yeah, I mean, innovation usually, starts with people having ideas and following these ideas. And what I've seen in practice over the last couple of years was really, really interesting. Because, after the ICO craze, or actually we could, even while, the ICO craze was running about, these projects usually had ideas. Sometimes these ideas revolved around, putting out protocols that solved a problem, which traditionally was done by a central authority, and they would solve this problem, without, cutting out the middleman, without needing any intermediary party to do anything about it. Other projects really were raising funds to develop something that was not really decentralized in the sense that we're discussing it here today. And what I've noticed then, so this was basically before we had any regulation. Then when, you know, in Europe, the AML regime for VASPs was put into place, and now with the licensing regime for CASPs on the MiCA, I saw a, you know, shift in, you know, the kinds of clients that I was advising, from, you know, the young entrepreneurs with an idea to more seasoned players with deep pockets. Because let's face it, if you want to obtain a license on the MiCA, you do need deep pockets. You need roles that you can, you know, have people fill out, and this needs resources. And what I've seen now, interestingly enough, is that, you know, since MiCA has this little carve out in Recital 22, the famous Recital 22, where crypto asset services, if they are provided in a fully decentralized manner, or if the crypto assets themselves, you know, are being, you know, operated on a decentralized platform, if you, you know, fall under this carve out, MiCA does not apply to you. And interestingly enough, what I've seen is people are now really trying to stay, and that's why I think that the term decentralization is so important, they are trying to fall under this exemption. So not to have to comply with the rules under MiCA. And I mean, you have a lot of experience with, I would assume, a lot of experience with apps that are working on your layer 1 infrastructure. Have you given them any, you know, advice is perhaps too strong of a word to say, but I guess you're in contact with people who are developing. How do they see that currently? Are they trying to be more decentralized than they used to because of regulation?
So I think there is that, but I would not say that that is one of the sort of macro trends, right? And part of the reason is that a lot of the startups or companies in Cardano aren't necessarily based in Europe. I mean, very, very simply, right? I do think you do see them discuss at a more general level and less sort of maybe specifically with regards to MiCA, although that may be part of the reason why they are discussing it under the hood. But I do think the topic of decentralization does come up regularly. It comes up particularly in crashes, right? Because with many of these applications, the DeFi applications, when the prices crash, you will get various mechanisms kicking in, right? So automated liquidations, people getting called on their positions, all of these types of things. And there was actually an interesting episode, and this is, you know, more anecdotal, but I think it does go to your point. Not too long ago, during the last pretty significant Friday crash, which you may have sort of seen at the time, where some currencies, you know, dropped, some tokens dropped by 70, 80%, at least for a short time. And this in turn triggered a lot of these types of liquidations and other instruments. And what was interesting is there was certain actors within Cardano specifically, but this was a general trend, that actually had mechanisms built into their platforms that allowed them to freeze the market. So basically stop the market, which is something we're quite familiar with in traditional exchanges, right? Where if things go completely haywire, you know, trading is stopped, either for individual equities or sometimes even for entire exchanges. The notion basically being that you want the market to work in a sound way. Now, of course, that's always a bit of a slippery slope, right? Because who defines where the line is? But what is fascinating is that there are almost two camps now, it seems, at least to me, in the blockchain space in general, and the DeFi space. Those that basically say, no, decentralization should be the goal. If the rules of the game are you get liquidated at, you know, in this market circumstance, it doesn't matter what triggers the circumstance, you should get liquidated. And then there's others who say, well, but from a user experience perspective, right, there can be good reasons to actually stop trading, to stop a market. And it's really, but of course that requires a certain amount of centralized control because somebody has to pull that trigger. You know, it takes discretion, right? Somebody has to say, this is too much. And so you're getting almost these different types of dApps where one basically says, hey, this is part of our system, it's this safeguard, but we control the safeguard. And others say, no, we don't want any of that, right? So it's almost like philosophy expressed in code, if you will, which I think is quite interesting. But it's not so much maybe specifically about MiCA, right? It's much more general about just kind of the principles of what you're building.
I wanted to address what you said regarding this recital. If you're fully decentralized and there's no identifiable issuer, then you're out of scope. But this is a trap, I think, because the moment they also say every token that is being traded on an exchange needs a white paper. They don't say who has to do it, but clearly, if you're not one of the whatever big five, you don't have the leverage with an exchange to negotiate for them to write the white paper and take the liability with it. And the moment you, as an issuer, even if you're very, very decentralized, write this white paper, the question arises, are you that centralized entity? Are you to be liable? I mean, it's a tricky kind of to sort it out, but you need to be distributing your token somewhere, and that is usually the exchange. So that's a bit like Sophie's choice, right? And this is why I would say they built in a trap.
Yeah, although, I mean, I've had a discussion with a client on this very specific point recently, just a week ago or so. And I mean, they were a big investor from in a project that started a couple of years ago, which is big now. They have a large stake, and they are interested to have these tokens listed on a centralized exchange without being, the initial issuers, or without being involved in the project development at all. And I mean, at least MiCA gives the ability for anybody to draw up the white paper. So I can go to a centralized exchange and say, hey, guys, I would like to have this token listed. I see it is not listed yet. I know now you need a white paper. Here goes. At least that's an option.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of boils down to risk appetite, like many things in this space, right? In terms of, well, are you willing to sort of take, because there are some latent, at least, risks in terms of, what does that mean from a liability perspective, right? From a civil law perspective, it doesn't make you the issuer, but MiCA certainly has a few provisions that are maybe not as clear as they could be in terms of what it could mean if you basically write what is effectively a third-party white paper, right? In terms of sort of, and Bitcoin has this, right? I mean, there's a few Bitcoin white papers because Bitcoin is a listed asset, but
there's no foundation. But I mean,
yeah, but there's literally
trickier.
nobody that sort of, right, that is the issuer there. I mean, it's the clearest example of basically this setup.
But there it's clear, right? But if you're a smaller, whatever, startup, you don't have this leverage. Like Bitcoin is like you cannot be an exchange and not have Bitcoin, but you can be an exchange and not have, I don't know, jumping rabbit. So
I am told it's a business model, though, right? That some exchanges basically offer this as a service. So they will write your white paper for you, and they will effectively take that risk, basically.
Okay, by now yeah, fair, right? Maybe.
And so, I guess you can I think of that as basically the market solving a problem that MiCA created, sort of in the vagueness of how some of these provisions are written. Whether that will ever blow back on these exchanges, I guess that is an open question. If things go very sideways. So, but I mean, this is sort of not necessarily a new topic, right? The disclosure side of these markets is quite interesting anyway, because let's be real. I mean, who reads these white papers? Yeah. Right. I mean,
the investor that is being carefully informed about the risks.
Yeah. I mean, this is a very real question, right? In general, in financial market regulation, is what are you trying to solve? And to me, at least, one of the things I'm not a huge fan of with MiCA is it feels to me like there is quite a big layer of performative bureaucracy to MiCA that I don't actually think really pursues effectively, right, the goals of protecting individuals operating in this market. But at the same time, of course, there's always the question of where are these things coming from? And with MiCA, with the disclosure regime, I mean, it is very closely modeled on MiFID and the equities market, right? And sometimes that's just enough reason for something to be transposed into basically a new regime, even though maybe, I mean, as far as I know, even some of the people who worked on MiCA thought that it was kind of overkill in terms of the disclosure regime. But it was the easiest political thing to do because everybody knew the disclosure regime, right? So nobody was going to question whether it was suitable, basically. Because if it works for equities, why wouldn't it work for, your token that you're issuing?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely all comes from traditional financial markets, right? So the prospectus regime under the EU prospectus regulation, which basically states you need a certain offer doc. I mean, it all comes from the US in reality, right? The idea being I think it does, inform your investors about your company when you think of a security, your history, the products you're offering, the risks that are associated with your company, the risks that are associated with the product that you're purchasing. And these ideas were then just put into MiCA when it comes to the offering of crypto assets. And when it comes to the crypto asset services that are now regulated, it's also pretty much a one-on-one copy from existing financial markets regulation.
We're talking a lot about financial markets regulations because that's what's out there right now. But I'm curious also where things are going, because the infrastructure, as you said before, the infrastructure level has been kind of exempt to a point. Although I think there's a lot of regulations that affect it or that are kind of not in the spotlight as much as MiCA has been. Like, privacy is just coming up since beginning of the year, and I think this will be a huge one because you have immutable blockchains. I think the right to be forgotten will be something that is hard to do on an immutable blockchain. On the other hand, 2 years ago there was the product liability directive. So you also have to kind of think of all the tech regulations where they are defining like what is liability for a product. They were actually back then thinking of self-driving cars and AI, right? And you had, they were thinking, oh, somebody should be liable if AI creates a car accident, which is fair enough, right? I mean, I would want that to be regulated. But their definition was if software, not defining what that is, has a bug or a data loss or a hack, the manufacturer, which is the developer, shall be responsible. And if you think of liability, I mean, there is a high incentive to steal tokens. It has happened before. There is always a bug in any software. And if we measure the value of a token, and we just need to look at the market caps, we're talking about a huge liability. And I don't think any developer would have wanted that risk in creating a little bug or building something. So these are like topics that are kind of under the radar, but if that would have went through, and I mean, we advocated for open source to be out of scope, but these are kind of regulations that are happening and nobody, like they're just not in the spotlight, right? And they would affect everybody. And then privacy, I mean, I think that is actually a bit more in the spotlight now because they're actively targeting blockchain. The product liability, they just didn't consider it at all. They just didn't think it would affect anything else than AI. That was just ignorance, but I wonder what else. I mean, we just started regulating. If you think of all the regulations that exist, if they start like looking into blockchain, there is so much more to come.
Yeah, no, agreed. I mean, I think the financial market regulation is obviously interesting to people because it's typically one of the strictest regulatory regimes we have, right? Just generally speaking. And consequently, if you run afoul of it, typically the consequences are some of the worst, right? Including not just financial damages, but also potentially jail time and similar things. And I think that's why people are so focused on it. But I agree that there is a ton of other things that are going on in terms of also, again, particularly the DApp layer, right? There's also the convergence of blockchain and AI, which is something that people are building things for, where, there's the AI Act and all of the associated regimes that, are going to have an impact, right, in terms of what you can actually do and roll out as a product in the EU. I will say, though, that at least from our assessment, from a sort of infrastructure perspective, yes, these are all relevant questions, but in terms of the project itself, we don't necessarily see them as sort of an existential threat, right? It's more about what can you build on top of it, and particularly the privacy question is really one of, well, what can you use this database for? And at least from my perspective, anyone who was trying to put personal information, on an immutable public ledger was probably always going to run into trouble. I mean, if it's not legal trouble, then it's probably going to just be people complaining about the fact that their information is in a very unfortunate place.
I mean that's not how they defined it, right? This data protection board came out and they were like, personal data is pseudonymous wallets, for example, if you KYC, the example was, if you KYC on an exchange and then you send something to a wallet and they have a data breach, now this wallet is connected with your ID forever, and whoever stole the data can forever and ever see all your, basically your transaction trail.
Yes, there is this ongoing debate in the data protection space between the absolute and the relative perspective, right? Sort of whether it's enough that it becomes personal data if anyone in the world could theoretically identify who it is, versus sort of could I reasonably identify as the person who's handling the data. So yes, that is a very real thing. I will say though, in practice, again, I mean, this goes to sort of the more technical and practical side of these L1s. You can even come to the conclusion that it's all personal information. So let's say all wallet IDs are personal information because they might have been KYC'd at some point by someone that might know that the person who's associated with it. But the fundamental truth is that even if that's the case, 2/3 of block producers, at least specifically for Cardano, are not within the EU. So again, for us, it might change how we run a node, right? As Cardano Foundation, as a legal entity, we might have to think about not doing that in the EU, for example, not addressing, even if we did that, which we don't, right? But not addressing it as a service to maybe EU participant citizens. But we, of course, what we try to do as an organization is really focus on sort of the existential risks to the protocol and the network, right? In terms of what could actually break the whole thing. I mean, that's really what we're concerned about. And I don't think this really fits that category, at least not so far, right? Because I think also from a consequence perspective, again, you're looking at primarily at monetary fines. Yeah. And the question is, well, who are you fining? And if it's all global, all operators of nodes globally, I mean, you get into just practicality sort of questions, right? Aside from the fact that I'm a strong proponent of the relative approach when it comes to GDPR, because I think the absolute one takes you to, not just for blockchain, but for all kinds of applications, to very, very strange places, right? That make very little practical sense, even if they are very neat from a sort of logical perspective.
That's fine. What I find actually most interesting is how far off the regulators are in terms of understanding the technology. And that's, I feel like you understand that when you read their proposal, how they imagine to break down on privacy issues on the tech. And I feel like there's a lot of education that needs to be done in that sense.
Yeah, and also something we should not forget is, I mean, at the end of the day, no matter how we define decentralization, at the end of the day, there's always people involved doing specific tasks. And if you wanted to go after the people, there's always a way. Be it, for example, going after developers or claiming that they are now responsible under, that they are responsible for damages that are being caused by the software, for example, or claiming that they are now, the data processors. You can always come up with some angle to pinpoint liability to the individual person. And I think it's really important to, first of all, not forget that and not to be, I mean, this would be the message that goes to the regulators or to the lawmakers, not to be inclined to make use of this ability too strongly. Because what would it lead to? Well, just the EU becoming less relevant of a market for anybody who wants to innovate and has to fear, to be attacked, by regulation on 4 sides. I think, if the lawmakers are listening, please keep that in mind.
I mean, I think the technology also solves a lot of issues that regulators are trying to solve, right? And I do believe that regulations are not necessarily solving issues, they're trying to mitigate them and try to kind of make a risk assess, reduce the risk or kind of monitor it, but they're not solving the underlying issue. And I think technology can do that. For example, if you think of all the compliance and paperwork and paper trail audits you have to do in order to, be compliant, imagine you could track the actions of a financial facilitator or institution on chain, and then you would have live real-time auditability, and that's it. You don't have to retrospectively prove that you acted right You know, like you can do it in time, and it would be much more modern, faster, no paperwork.
Right, but that would require that, you know, either the lawmaker or the regulator defines a standard that everybody has to comply with, which would not work unless, you know, we're forcing people, or that the state itself were to look at each project individually and then grab the data, you know, based on the definitions that were made by this project.
I mean, there could be like compliance oracles that automatically just flag risks or stuff. I mean, we have technology, right? There would be options to modernize the process like this.
Right, that's true.
I mean, look, I think fundamentally, and Cardano Foundation happens to actually be building a version of this in terms of the audit data. So basically a solution where you can take data from your auditing system, from your ERP system, and basically post it to the blockchain at different aggregation levels. And the end state that we're actually going for which we also have to convince our auditors, is this notion that you could get to a point where, you know, when they come in once a year to look at the financial data for the year, what they're looking at is effectively a cryptographically proven tree of all bookings and changes to those bookings that actually exists on chain. However, we have to be very aware of the fact that that only works because we are a very public entity to begin with, right? We already publish most of our financial data. We did so before this solution existed, just in a more traditional PDF format. And I think there again, you get into this question, well, what kind of issue are you solving for people? And typically, my experience is that the best sort of adoption conversations for blockchain, or for any technology, happen when you're actually not talking about blockchain, right? They happen when you're actually explaining to people how you're solving an existing problem or challenge that they have in a business context, and you're doing it in such a way that you will save them, at the end of the day, typically effort or actual money, right? And for this question in particular of basically auditability, I think the pitch can be that if you are comfortable with a certain level of disclosure, public disclosure, you could save a lot of money potentially in the audit process, right? And a lot of effort, because effectively the auditor's task would be a much more technical and a much more narrower one than if he has to come in and basically spot check all of the accounts and all of the books, right? But it doesn't necessarily do away with the role, which I think is oftentimes what some people sort of actually wish for, right? Is to get rid of the entire role sort of in the assurance process. I mean, this goes to regulators or auditors, that really they hope the technology will effectively make the role unnecessary.
I mean the compliance officer role?
No, just the auditor role, right? That you don't need the auditor or the regulator anymore. And I think that has a certain charming, but ultimately I do think it's a bit naive, because the regulators and the auditors, actually good ones at least, do more than just check a box, right? There is a qualitative component to what they do. And as such, I'm not necessarily a believer sort of in that, at least not in the financial market context, right? Where if they do a good job, they're doing much, much more than just sort of checking off a number. But again, I think it's an efficiency question. Like, can you save effort? And I think there is quite a lot of potential, right, of these technologies, including AI, right, as well. And the convergence of it is quite interesting, because you could actually potentially save quite a bit of effort that we put into compliance today on that front.
I mean, in terms of AI, I think it would be super in terms of transparency. It wouldn't resolve, if it would be running on a decentralized blockchain, it wouldn't resolve the issue of accountability, because you're basically deferring that to on-chain governance where there is no one person, responsible. But in terms of transparency, maybe it would resolve the issue of the black box, where you don't know which data has been used, who and how has it been deployed. And I think you could be able to track that much better on blockchain, and the AI is asking for transparency and I think traceability or something like this. So you would have that aspect resolved, but you still would have the issue of accountability, at least in a decentralized ecosystem.
Well, and at the end of the day, right, blockchains are databases. They're
right.
Database infrastructures, and consequently, if you put bad data in, you'll get bad data out. I mean, it's that simple, right? And I do think sometimes people talk about these technologies, AI is included in that, right? In sort of the context of that they hope that it will solve the qualitative issue we sometimes have with the data we use for various purposes. And that I've never understood, because it doesn't do that. What it does is it creates effectively a golden ledger, right? An objective truth that is very, very hard to change for certain things. And that does have value. I mean, at a societal level, think about, you know, if you need to go back and look at the figures for a listed company from 8 years ago, there is currently, to my knowledge, no real way, certainly not as the general public, to actually do something like that and have any assurance that that data hasn't changed, right? You're looking for a PDF that somebody uploaded to a website. I mean, that's effectively what you're doing. So I do think for certain use cases, there is actual societal value, if you will, in actually having sort of an immutable source of truth. But whether or not and how much that's worth, right, is a bit of a different conversation. And you're right. I mean, effectively, if you really wanted to make this scale, you might even need a legal mandate, like an actual, you know, a rule that says this is required for certain contexts. Otherwise, it's always a one-to-one conversation about whether people are convinced that this actually adds value. So,
right. I mean, I just wanted to come back to reading out loud once more the topic of our discussion today. Decentralization on trial, what regulation means for layer 1 governance in Europe. I mean, if I, you know, were to recap our discussion so far, then really for the layer 1 protocols, it doesn't change too much or does not have much of an impact at all. I think we can agree on that, right? Or do you see any areas where it does definitely have impact, which we have not discussed so far? Because at the moment, you know, if I think back on our discussion, it seems that, I mean, we do see implications for, you know, applications that are built on layer 1 protocols, but for the protocol itself, it's more or less, we're not there yet. Maybe under MiCA 2, but at the moment it's not really that much of a concern or has not that much of an impact. Or would you see that differently?
I think I agree for the ones that are pre-existing. I think it's a bit more nuanced for, which we haven't really talked about yet, right, would be sort of the new projects. So this goes back to the grandfathering discussion from earlier for the US, right? I think for a new project that is trying to build a new L1, I do think the fact that MiCA exists and, you know, all of the implementing legislation and rule sets for it exists could have quite a bit more of an influence, because back when many of the projects that are maturer, many of the L1s came about, it was kind of a free-for-all, right? It was the Wild West. People could kind of do basically what they wanted in terms of the issuance, mostly as long as they stuck within the AML rules. That was usually sort of the one thing you should avoid, right? Is just taking unchecked money from anyone. But that's always kind of been the case in the financial market for the last 30 or 40 years. I think really that is maybe the big difference. If you are a new project, I do think the landscape has shifted quite a bit. I do think you mentioned it, right? There is probably a deeper pocket component to spinning up a new L1, because you do need a bit more advice. You do need to think a bit more about sort of how you're issuing the token, how you're going to get it listed, what the implications are. Of course, you can just still do that and just take the risk, but I think that has changed, right? And in that sense, the barrier to entry, and the US is going in the same direction, the barrier to entry for new L1s has gotten quite a bit higher than it was.
Right, but always within, you know, also when you're obtaining advice, it's always with an aim of making sure that you do not fall in any trap of capital markets regulation or financial markets regulation, and to stay outside the scope of MiCA. But if we, you know, Nathalie, if we think, same question to you, do you think that there's any, you know, specifics of MiCA and regulation in general that we've not discovered or that we've not discussed as of now, which does have an impact on layer 1 infrastructure? And I mean, I do see the point for new layer 1s, but again, there you can try and model around. So it's just a way of, it's basically the same problem that they may also have had in the past, where try to, you know, get your product out without falling into any of the pits that are out there, legal pits. Yeah, but so both for existing and new layer 1 protocols, do you see that, do you have a fundamentally different view?
No, not really. I mean, we already kind of concluded, right? Decentralization, yes, but then there's the white paper, sure, you can outsource that. Grandfathering, yes, good for you, but then if you're a new project, you have a huge barrier. So I think for MiCA, for now, that would be the short takeaway, right? As far as I see it. I do think, though, now that we've resolved this, the next big wave will, I mean, they are very aware of decentralization, especially when it comes to DeFi. So I do expect to see more in that direction and more attempts in breaking that down. Maybe breaking down on the interface layers, breaking down on whoever is making financial gains. So I can imagine many projects deferring to open source more and more, trying to not, be the main intermediary. So I think open source would be an argument to protect some of the projects. I think all the applications that build on top of layer ones are, I mean, sure, we have mentioned that how are you going to implement privacy regulations or any if we can be international and anyways, but if you are building on top and you're interested in having an ecosystem that grows and evolves and startups that can grow, you also want to make sure that these barriers don't affect those startups, right? Because the underlying infrastructure benefits from that. So you want to support that, and all these small projects are in different sections, from finance to AI to whatever, compliance or gaming. You want to make sure that they are enabled to. And I think this is,
just maybe one point. I mean, I think to be clear, right, our goal is to make Cardano, whether it's MiCA or something else, right, but effectively to make it that the infrastructure is compliant with EU regulations wherever possible. It's one of the reasons we were, I still believe, the first L1 to have, all the sustainability data, right, for Cardano that is required under MiCA for certain disclosures, even though technically we had no obligation to do that. That was purely because of what I look at this problem as, which is lowering the cost of ownership and the cost of running and doing things on Cardano, right? That is ultimately the goal. And I agree with you that I think this question of what's going to happen with MiCA, I think the discussion around decentralization and Recital 22 and how it's interpreted and where the lines are, I think is going to be central to a revision of MiCA or potentially MiCA 2 or whatever the follow-up legislation will be called. And I think there, we will of course take a look at that, and that is how I view our job on the policy side, both in terms of input to the legislation, but then also, whatever it turns out to be, to figure out ways where we can make it easier for people to use Cardano to build on top of it. And sometimes those are obvious things, like with the sustainability data, it was pretty obvious that if you don't have a good source of data, then you're just going to have bad data. That might be a reputational problem for the ecosystem and for the network, right? But also, if every project has to kind of find that data themselves, then people are going to be paying multiple times, and so forth. Sometimes it's a bit harder to sort of identify that one thing that you can do to make it easier, right, to lower the cost. So I think that's sort of going to be the challenge for us going forward as well. And I think we keep coming up with ideas to make it easier to build on Cardano, but it's not always trivial because the projects are also very different. Right? If you're doing track and trace on Cardano, it's a very different proposition regulatorily than if you're doing DPP, for example, right, in the EU now, the digital product passport as a topic. It's very different than if you're trying to run a DEX. I mean, those are just fundamentally different industries and different frameworks, and consequently, you can't kind of necessarily find things that fit all of those boxes.
Yeah, I think the sustainability data that you mentioned is a good example. Nathalie, do you think that there's more that a layer one could do or should do for its community?
Oh, I think there is a huge potential in communities. I mean, they're very eager to support their ecosystem. There's a lot of knowledge, and I think huge part of advocacy is education, explaining the technology and also working against prejudice, right? I mean, you have not like you have, let's say in the parliament, you have 720 parliamentarians. Do they all understand the technology? No, but will they vote on it? Oh, yes. So there, and you can have like, each party has their prejudice, right? So unfortunately, for example, in the early days of MiCA, or the stage 1 of MiCA, the whole discussion with proof of work should be banned and all of these things. I was so surprised to see the Green Party, the Socialists, whatever, like the left-leaning half, super critical of blockchain, because I know why, because of all the FTX scandals and the Silk Road connection and the high energy consumption, all these headlines they read, right? But they were not aware of all the solutions it brings, resolving all the monopoly issues we had with Web 2, the data problems, like the privacy issues, like not owning your data, all these kinds of issues that I believe they would very much like to be solved. They would like to see solved. I mean, MiCA is a specific case, but my point is like fundamentally they're like having trust issues or with this industry. And I think if they would just understand it better, they would actually see a lot of solutions of problems they advocate against for. So I think the ecosystems could play a bigger role in that and just facilitating knowledge, being, more open to it. I think everything is a trade-off. The same way you have trade-offs on the blockchain, in blockchain governance, in terms of how fast you make decisions or how do you say, inclusive do you make decisions? It's a trade-off, right? You can't have both at the same time. And the same is happening in policy, right? Either you are for security or for privacy, but both at the same time is tricky because security means more monitoring, privacy means less. So you both have merit, but you have to debate. And I think it's a two-way street, right? You have to also make the ecosystems understand that it's not all evil and it can also be beneficial. And reverse, you have to make policymakers understand all the benefits of the technology and all the problems it will solve for problems they're trying to solve. So it's like a win-win situation.
Right. And I think also what plays a role is that, the protocol usually is accessible from all around the world. And there's potentially, I don't know how many countries there are at the moment, 180 or something, who might, have their own view of what needs to be done. And I guess it's just virtually impossible to keep track of everything that's going on in the world in terms of crypto regulation. Is that a consideration too?
That is a huge consideration just in practice, right? I think one thing is to have the ambition to be present, take part in education and conversation, and then also in all the policy work that's going on. For us practically, right, for Cardano Foundation, we are, 2.5 resources, right, for basically the entire policy space. So very practically, we basically have to just triage very hard on the basically funnel coming in, where we just say, okay, these are the 2 jurisdictions primarily that we're focused on, right, and then what are we focused on? Well, we're focused on things where we think others aren't making an impact. So one of the things we've done a lot of in the last few years, which I think not many have, at least if you look at the list of the contributions, is trying to also get in the door with standard setters, which is just something that I naturally did already some work in. So BCBS, right, banking regulation, banking standards is one of those topics. And part of the reason for that was one, that I thought if you're the only voice in the room advocating for the view of the L1s, right, you might actually have more impact. Whereas, for example, in the US Congress, there is already 8 to 10 L1s on any given day that are trying to sort of push the notion of sort of what the rule set should be. Now, those positions do differ quite a bit because the L1s are not all the same, right? And they have slightly different parameters. But realistically, a lot of that gets fudged in the parliamentary process because it's, as Nathalie was just saying, people vote on things they don't understand. They even amend things they don't necessarily understand because they're given a position or they take a position on something because they think they understand it. So what happens, in my experience, at least also in Switzerland, typically is that you will get an initial take, which comes from the executive branch, right, on things, and then it turns into a much muddier and sort of slightly less clear end product through the parliamentary process. That's just kind of a universal trait, I think, of these governance systems. And as such, we're trying to kind of pick and choose where we can, hopefully have sort of more of an impact. But I think this is a problem that everyone has, just in different degrees. I don't know how many resources you were at Polkadot. Maybe that would be interesting, right? Exactly, right. So I think this is a general trend. I think the only example that I know of where the numbers are somewhat, public is Coinbase, which, has a policy and regulatory team that is in the sort of measures in the 50s. So like they have around 50 people doing this type of work. But of course, they have a very, very practical potential upside on it, right? Which is their entire business model is predicated on regulatory compliance for the US retail customer. So it's also easier to justify a significant expense, I imagine, versus us, where we're covering so many domains from engineering to policy work, and there's just only so many resources to go around.
I mean, I don't know about you, but my impression is that the US-based blockchains are much more open to advocacy, and they're investing more into it. And the European ones are very much like tech-focused, you know, that's, if I ignore it, it's gonna ignore me, but it's not necessarily the case, right? So it's just a more, I don't know. I don't know how many, I don't know very many Europe-based blockchains that are active in that. Maybe what's your view?
That's partially true. Yeah, I do think the US business culture in general is sort of more keen to do advocacy and you know, outright lobbying, right? So I do think there's some truth to that. I think there's also just a resourcing component, though, from what I've seen. And maybe that's connected, right? The comfort level with the work means you're also more likely to get resources. But I think it's also, I mean, a bit risky to call any of these projects, you know, European or American, right? I
Fair,
mean,
they're all
in practical purposes,
yes.
Because they are very much global. And speaking just for Cardano, right, we have a significant Asian component to Cardano because the issuance happened there. There's a very significant US community. So I think it's, you know, it's a bit of a mixed bag. I think it's really a priority issue. I think there's also some L1s in the US that don't do so much. And then there are some that are very, very vocal and very present, right? I mean, I think back in the day when, you know, when the Gary Gensler days that we were talking about before, I imagine some people would have said, well, Polkadot is, you know, super, super present in the US Congress. Because sometimes people also only see the surface.
That's
right?
the other problem, right?
I mean, I'm sure you got questions of like, how did you get in, like, how did you get in the door, right? How were you able to sit down sort of in this kind of thing? And maybe, you know, there's always a coincidental component to these things. I mean,
it's timing, it's also
yes,
the story
exactly.
you have to tell. So, I mean, and telling the story, right? I mean, we had almost 100 one-on-one meetings, knocking on doors and telling the story. And until someone was like, actually, some more people need to hear the story. So that's how you do it. But I agree. I mean, that was just the beginnings of it, right? The Gary Gensler kind of woke up the urgency for the industry. I feel like because he was so, you know, pushy, he woke up urgency in the industry and kind of disrupted that. And all of a sudden there was urgency and, oh, we should, you know, actually maybe do something about this. Whereas others took the opposite approach and were like, actually, we're not picking sides. I mean, with changing politics, there was also this notion, do you have to pick sides? And you don't want to do that as in any, you know, ecosystem. You just want to represent your tech and you know, explain your tech and yeah, make sure that regulation doesn't entirely destroy it or prohibit it.
If I remember an interview by the Coinbase policy head, right? One of the things that stuck with me from that interview was the notion that his view, right, of the history of crypto in the US was, for a few years, Coinbase sort of thought they had a tech problem or an explaining problem, right? In terms of not getting through to the right people so that they could get what they wanted. And then, as he views it, or at least as I understood what he said, at some point they realized, actually, we have a politics problem. And that's when they put a lot more effort into the actual advocacy and the actual being present in Washington, D.C., right? So I think there's also just that component of what problem are you trying to solve. I do think the US was quite a bit different in the last 10 years than almost all other jurisdictions that I at least touched in terms of the landscape and sort of the, I don't want to call it sort of hostility, but I do think sort of the attitude towards crypto, at least on some parts, with how the projects were treated and how certain things were handled. I mean, I know that for us, right, Cardano particularly, we were part of some of these SEC procedures. The token was, right, as one of them was the Coinbase case. And I did always get the impression from across the pond that there was just a lot of more emotion in it in the US than maybe over here with MiCA, which I think is viewed as more of a technocratic thing, whether that's accurate or not, right? But I think the public discourse certainly is less emotionally charged than than it was in the US around the SEC and the Howey test. So that's just interesting to observe.
It became party politics, right? I mean, if you think of, if you're putting yourself on the, like, in the position of a politician, you want to pick topics that you can position yourselves with. You want, by the end of the, you know, legislative period, you want to show this is what I did. And you want to do it with topics that you can actually, you know, publicly talk about. In Europe, for example, maybe you don't want to say, I supported the tobacco industry. You know, it's also like public sentiment. You have to consider that. So if you're having a topic and you're representing someone that the public doesn't love, you're not going to find a politician just before elections that's going to stick up his name for it. So part of it is finding someone or politicians that want to kind of put that tag on their name and be champions for that. Is one aspect. And in the US, that was very much the case, right? The Republicans were kind of positioning themselves as we were tech and innovation friendly. That was kind of the spin, right? And the other side is protecting investors, you know, the small men and women that need to be protected from this. So you have to kind of have a sentiment of, okay, where will where will you land, and what is their needs and their positions, and what is the public sentiment? And in Europe, it's a bit different. You're right. So on a commission level, it's very technical. And then it goes to the parliament where it's much more political. You can have horse trading, literally. I gave you my vote if you get me the other vote for the other thing. And also Europe, like European politicians are far away from national politics, right? So even if something happens in Europe, it is far-fetched that the average Joe in whatever Berlin minding his business will know or realize what's happening on Brussels levels, right? Yes, it will be more emotional on a parliamentary, in the parliament, and it will be more political and not necessarily logical, but maybe they have less pressure, public pressure, than maybe a national government would have towards their voters, because these debates are much more like amplified in national media, and people maybe debate more. But what happens in a third country, like in Brussels, is less. So there's like, and also it's a different, culture. I noticed that very much. So arguments that would work very well in Europe were like a no-no in the US, and reverse. And also public pressure, like in the US, you go vocal very fast, and it's something that works, and you show that you're advocating very loudly. In Europe, you will burn bridges this way very fast. So that's all these kind of nuances that come into play, but
I think we have a fascinating discussion, but unfortunately all good things have to come to an end at some point. But before we close, you know, decentralization layer 1. Imagine you have a listener either with the regulators or with a lawmaker. What's one thing that you would like to tell them directly?
I think one of the fascinating landscapes that if I were a lawmaker or regulator would be really watching is this governance space, right? I think there's a few layer 1 infrastructures that are moving to what I would say, you know, is true decentralized governance. Decentralized in the sense that it's more bottom up. It's the owners of the tokens or their representatives or whatever the system is, right? But basically where the decisions about where the infrastructure is going, maybe even what the infrastructure, which sounds a bit strange, right? But basically that is the case with some of these, including Cardano, what the infrastructure is maybe spending money on, its own money, right? These decisions are basically being taken by the users, the holders of the tokens. Now this is not completely new, right? There's particularly quite a few DeFi apps that have been using governance tokens to make decisions for quite a while. But I do think for the L1 infrastructures, it is something that is coming more and more. And I do believe that this is sort of an interesting frontier, also again, from the discussion we were having earlier about what is decentralization, right? And who's taking the decisions, which I do think is a core component of that question. If you want to use that as a metric and as a thing to look at, who is taking decisions? How are the decisions being taken? What do the metrics look like, right? Is it 5 people ultimately sort of influencing the decision, or is it 50, or is it 500? these types of debates, I think, are compared to some of the others that I think people are quite familiar with now after 10 years of this space, I do think are still on the up and coming in many ways. And I think they will play a role for all of the discussions we had today about what is maybe falls within the regulated sphere, what doesn't, what are the safeguards that we're using, and what is effectively the financial market is just one example. What are they allowed to touch? Because I think that's going to be one of the mechanisms that people use to regulate these industries, right? Instead of trying to regulate the individual stake pool operators or the people running nodes, which is very difficult and arguably also might not sort of be reasonable, you just basically limit what people may interact with that are regulated, right? And that's one way of effectively limiting the impact and limiting the influence. So I think this is going to be a fascinating space to watch.
Decentralization one-on-one, what I would want to know a politician? Or what? What was it?
No, just imagine that there is now a lawmaker or regulator watching. What's one thing that you would like to tell them directly?
I would love to have them understand that decentralization is a way of coordinating risk in a way, or like diffusing risk. So instead of having a single point of failure, you're de-risking a system. Think of European servers. We're having a lot of cyber risks now, more attacks, more, we would need systems that are more resilient, and decentralization is a way and an infrastructure setup that would allow for that. And decentralized governance systems are basically a democracy in the internet, and it gives the users the power back to decide. And I think monopolies in the internet have been a risk, and this is also a solution for that. So I would want them to understand that this is not all finance, this is infrastructure. We're talking about internet infrastructure here, and there are endless use cases, and all we're doing here is bringing new features to the internet that haven't existed before, and this allows for new use cases and new solutions, and it partially resolves issues we have seen in the past.
Yeah. Nobody should look at every problem from, there's 1,000 ways to look at specific problems. Nobody is discussing email in terms of financial market regulation because you could, enter into a future agreement through email. So I think that's a really important takeaway. Dear both, it was a pleasure to speak with you today. Thanks a lot for coming.
Thank you.
It was really, really great. I hope our audience found our discussion as interesting and illuminating as I did. And thanks so much for watching, and looking forward to seeing you another time.